As we enter this new year, there is one thing that is certain. We have lots of information, perhaps more than ever before. But at the same time, it's becoming harder to separate the facts from fiction. And to make it even more complicated, humans are biased by nature. We prefer information that we like. So how do we fix that problem? We're going to get some good advice now because an economist and professor at the London Business School has given his best advice in a book called May Contain Lies. And let me introduce now, please give a warm welcome to Professor Alex Edmans.
Good morning, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here to kick off this really important day. So in 2017, Matthew Walker released a book called Why We Sleep, about the huge public health crisis by insufficient sleep and how sleep has a huge number of benefits for our health. Now, this became an international bestseller. Why? Well, perhaps two reasons. One is we wanted it to be true. We'd all like an excuse to spend an extra hour in bed, and we'd like to believe that our over-eager beaver colleagues who get up at 5 a.m, they will meet their comeuppance someday. And the second reason is this was, let's to be fair, it was based on evidence. And what's some of the evidence? Well, what are the consequences of getting up too early? Well, maybe if you are sleep deprived, you're going to have accidents. You're going to walk into podiums and you're going to bump your head. And this was the evidence that he suggested, is that the more you sleep, the lower the chance of injury. That was backed up with the data. Matthew Walker stresses how he has a PhD, so everything he says must be true. And so people lapped up this evidence and said, well, there's a huge best-selling book. This is the authority on the importance of sleep. But there's a problem with this, because if you look at the source for this graph, that was the scientific paper published in a top journal. But if you go back to the underlying paper, it has a quite different graph. So this was the graph from the paper that he was citing, and this has an actual extra bar here, which shows that if you were to sleep for 5 hours, then you have less injuries than not just 6, but also 7. But because this didn't go with what he wanted to be true, Matthew Walker just cut this out. Okay, so the book was supposedly based on evidence, but the evidence was selective. If there was data which goes against your claim that more sleep is always better, let's just cut this out. And this is not just an isolated case. Throughout the book, there's many, many other examples of being selective with data in this worldwide authority on the importance of sleep. Now, what is one more important thing than sleep? Well, one more important issue could be a matter of life or death. And this surrounds the opioid crisis, which has killed about 650,000 people in the US, millions of people, sadly, around the world. And you might think, well, how can it be that so many people were given opioids despite being so addictive? Well, the answer is, based on evidence, that actually it's not addictive. Because there was an article written in the New England Journal of Medicine, an authoritative journal, which showed, as the title suggests, addiction rare in patients treated with narcotics. You can prescribe these opioids and people will not get addicted. But if you actually look at the article, well, here's the first page of the article. Where's page 2 or 3 or page 5? Where are the tables with all the statistics? There are none. So the entire article was just a letter to the editor. And based on this letter to the editor, these opioids were prescribed, this paper was cited by 1,650 other articles, not knowing that this was not a scientific study, it was nothing more than just a letter. And let's say the letter was entirely true, that the writer was not falsifying anything. What did the letter say? It said it studied the effect of at least one narcotic preparation. So maybe one dose of opioids doesn't lead to addiction, but maybe 5 or 6 will. And also it looked at hospitalized patients, But that's quite different to prescribing opioids as an outpatient. Maybe in hospital you won't get addicted because you're given this under control basis, but if you're given this as an outpatient, maybe you'll take too much. So this is really concerning, but you might think, what does this have to do with investing? Why am I kicking off an investment conference with 2 studies about health? Well, this highlights 2 points which will be a big theme throughout my talk. Number 1 is we like to quote data all the time to support investment decisions, but what was actually said? Are we quoting it accurately, or are we listening to other people who are actually misquoting something in the same way that Matthew Walker was actually misquoting the graph? And number 2, even if we're quoting somebody accurately, what are they actually measuring? So for the opioids paper, they were looking at hospitalised patients when what we care about is outpatients, and they're only looking at 1 dose. And many of the important things that might drive our investing behaviour, particularly intangible factors like sustainability, that is really difficult to measure. Right? There's studies all the time claiming sustainable companies do better, but really what matters is how do we measure sustainability? That is something which is much more complex. And why is it that we don't often ask these questions? Why do we believe things which aren't really backed up with the data? It's not that we're bad people, it's that we're people. And if we're people, we suffer from confirmation bias. So what is that? That's the idea that in the brain we have a striatum. And when we see something we like, which is sleep is going to be helping our health, or we can prescribe opioids to get rid of people's chronic pain, and there's not going to be consequences which are negative. We want this to be true, we lap it up uncritically, and we're not going to be critical of it because the striatum will release dopamine into our body. We believe this and we don't ask these difficult questions. So let me now take this, and let's now take this away from medicine to our chosen field of investing. And this was something that I lived myself. So in 2013, I was just going through my inbox, which is a rather sort of laborious task, and then there was an email which came in my inbox which struck me. So this was from one of the most powerful investors in the world, Sally Krawcheck. And I thought, well, what would such a famous investor have to do with somebody like me? Well, the article, there was no subject line, is this spam? But actually it seemed to be a genuine email. So she said she'd heard about my research showing a strong link between employee satisfaction and long-term stock returns. That's the importance of human capital for the long-term performance of companies. And so she wanted to meet. So we met in the Dorchester Hotel in Hyde Park, London, a very good location for one of the most powerful investors on Wall Street. And she chatted to me, and she said, well, she was wanting to launch a fund based on diversity. And this is the idea that diverse companies do better, something I absolutely wanted to be true as an ethnic minority myself. And given my work on employee satisfaction, she asked, well, could I do a similar study looking at the link between diversity and performance, which also showed a positive result? And I said, well, I could certainly try. I can't guarantee you what the results are going to look like, but there are probably lots of different measures out there on diversity. And her particular lens was gender diversity. And I said, maybe you can look at the number of women in the boardroom, in the wider workforce, gender pay gap, all of these things. I'm going to take a look and I'll report back to you. And so I went and crunched the data, and there were about 24 different measures of gender diversity that I could have looked at. But despite being so excited, and I thought, well, this is my opportunity to work with one of the most powerful investors, virtually all of them came out to be negative. So I was really disappointed with that. But not all of them were negative, because out of the 24 of them, 2 of them were positive. Now, one of them was not significant, but this was one which was significant. So I had a couple of options. I could, number one, report back to Sally, hey, this is positively related with your investment thesis and it's significant. Or maybe I could report the two ones that were positive and say, hey, one of them is not significant, but out of transparency and honesty, I'm going to report it. But this one is significant. You can launch your fund based on this idea. But that would be wrong. Why? Because I hadn't looked at one or two measures. I'd looked at 24 measures. And if indeed what I should be as a researcher, which is close to the data, I need to report all of them, not just the ones that I want to be true. So I reported all 24. And Sally was very thankful. She was disappointed, but she said, oh, well, thank you for doing all of this research. Unfortunately, it doesn't support the thesis. And so I went away, disappointed, because I thought, well, maybe I could have helped her launch this fund. But I had been an academic for 6 years by that time. And I know the research process is one where you have ideas, and sometimes the data just does not work out. You have to move on. And so I moved on. Then 6 months later, I saw on LinkedIn a fund being launched by Sally, the Global Women's Leadership Fund, based on the idea that companies with more diverse leadership teams outperform. I thought, well, this is surprising because I'd run 24 different tests for Sally and I found that there was no systematic link. So then we think about my first question. What was actually measured here? Now, diversity, that's not difficult to measure, but how did they measure performance? What they did was they took a study which measured performance in these different ways: return on sales, return on invested capital, return on equity. These are not irrelevant, but as investors, we care about long-term total shareholder return. That is the bottom line. It can be that some companies are not hugely profitable nowadays, maybe tech companies, but their stock prices go through the roof. Why? Because we care about future growth prospects and future potential. And isn't that something that diversity should lead to? Something like innovation. So they cherry-picked quite different measures of performance from the ones that we care about and launched the fund. And why does this matter? Well, unfortunately, since the fund's launch, it has significantly outperformed the benchmark, and that's not just true for that particular fund, but other funds based on this investment theme. Okay, and so you might think, okay, that's quite sort of harsh of me to point a finger at some other research, and we know that if you point a finger at somebody, 3 fingers point back at you. So let me now point the finger at my own organisation, London Business School, which I'm proud to be a professor at. This is only just a statement about the actual data, nothing to do with what I want to be true or not. Is that there was a couple of years ago, I saw that LBS had written a report claiming that diversity was linked to performance. And this was not just any report. It was for the Financial Reporting Council, the UK regulator. So this would become law. And I was hugely proud that my own organisation had written a report finding that diversity is linked to financial performance. Again, something I really care about personally. But then when I looked at the actual data, they'd run 90 different regressions and not a single one was significant. So they basically lied about their results. Right, so some of these correlations are actually in the wrong direction, and none of these values are even close to 5%, which is the threshold for statistical significance. And so that goes to the issue of what was actually said. So you can have a report claiming you find a strong link, even if all your own tables and all your own data contradicts that. But people might lap this up, again, because they want this to be true. So let's go back to this question of confirmation bias. So how do these studies make you feel? You might actually feel uncomfortable. You might think, well, I hope that this conference would start with a really positive talk about the importance of sustainability or diversity. I feel uncomfortable that it started with a talk giving an inconvenient truth. And so the second point about confirmation bias is not just accepting things uncritically because we want them to be true, but we often reject inconvenient truths that contradict our worldview. Because in addition to having a striatum, we also have an amygdala in our brain. And so that is the part of the brain that is activated when we see something we don't like. We feel that it's being the same as a tiger attack. So we don't listen to this evidence. If the evidence suggests, well, actually, there might not be this link, we want to dismiss it. We don't actually listen to it with an open mind. We view this like a tiger attack. And so this is why on a lot of topics that we might care about and which matter for investing decisions, we might not be listening to the evidence. Why? Because we will be latching onto what we want to be true. And if there's something suggesting that this is actually not backed up by the data, we will dismiss it. We might claim that it was a political agenda behind this research rather than trying to listen to it. So, if these studies made you feel uncomfortable, let me now ease this discomfort with some much more positive research on diversity. So if I go back to this question of what was actually measured, so this data on diversity only looks at gender, and there's other papers which look at ethnicity. So this reduces the totality and the complexity of a person to just their gender and ethnicity. That suggests that if you are a white male, you can never add to the diversity of an organisation, even if your background is humanities and everybody else is in finance, or maybe you're the first person in your family to ever go to university. But what really matters in terms of diversity is cognitive diversity, is diversity of thought. And also, what does DEI stand for? It stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about having a broad mix of people, but making sure they feel valued and willing to share. And so this is something I wanted to look at myself. So I wanted to say, well, all these measures of diversity, they're very reductive. They only look at something very superficial. Let's try to get a measure of cognitive diversity, but also equity and inclusion. How are people actually being treated? So some of you might know my work on employee satisfaction, which takes a survey of 5,000 employees within a company and asks them questions on 58 different things. And many of those dimensions have nothing to do with diversity. They're like, I'm given the tools and resources to do my job, but some of them are linked to diversity, such as this is a psychologically and emotionally healthy place to work. People here are treated fairly, regardless of their age, or their race, or their sex, or their sexual orientation. So this is more about inclusion rather than just demographic diversity. And so what I found was two main things. Number one is this more holistic measure of DEI. This actually bears little relationship with demographic diversity, whether it be in the board or in the C-suite or the wider workforce. So there could be many companies which are hitting the target but missing the point. They're doing well on traditional demographic diversity measures, but they're not promoting cognitive diversity or actually equity and inclusion. And why does this distinction matter? Because if we're linking it to future performance, what I find is that my broader measure of DEI is positively correlated with performance and valuation and innovation, but the more reductive measure of just demographic diversity, that bears no correlation, just like the earlier work that I showed you also found no link. And so this shows you just how important getting the right data is. It's not just an academic question of let's be academically and technically right. It really matters for investment decisions. Yes, it's really tempting to believe studies claiming, oh, just look at demographic diversity and then your returns are going to go up. This means that as an investor, you could be lazy. All you need to do is to look at the gender or ethnic mix of the board of directors and decide whether to invest. Well, if that was so easy, it would be priced into the market and you wouldn't be able to earn a return on that. Instead, when we actually think about what does it mean for a company to be truly diverse and inclusive, this requires you to get your hands dirty, look at deeper measures, and that is what's linked to future performance, not just these simple metrics, even though you might want them to be true. And so this is an idea that I developed in my recent book, May Contain Lies, that Cyrilla was mentioning at the start. And so what that book looks at is all of the different types of misinformation that you see out there. Now you might think, well, that's not new. We've got loads of other books out there on misinformation. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionaries defined post-truth as the word of the year. So for at least 8 years, we've known about the importance of sticking to the facts. And I think all of those other books that I read were really good. I'm not going to criticise them because I view them as rival books, but they were so good, they were so comprehensive, that they came up with 250 ways in which we can be misinformed. And then it's difficult for a busy person to remember all 250 and put them into practice. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to break down all the different types of misinformation into just 4 steps. And those 4 steps I display in something I call the ladder of misinference. And why do I use a ladder? Because we start from some facts and we draw conclusions and use those conclusions to guide our investing. We are drawing inferences. But why I call this the ladder of misinference and why some of the higher rungs are broken is sometimes we lead to incorrect conclusions from the data that we have. So the first step of the ladder of misinference is the idea that a statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. Matthew Walker says the more sleep, the fewer injuries. That's not backed up by the data. This study in the New England Journal of Medicine says that if you give opioids, you won't be addicted. That's not backed up by the data. And then there's studies on simple measures of diversity and financial performance. That is also not accurate. Yes, everybody can quote that, but actually when you look under the hood, this data is not that accurate. So that is the first step of the ladder. So let me now take you through the other 3 before going to Q&A. So the second step might be, well, if the problem is people being misquoted, then don't we just go and check the facts? Let's go to the other underlying source to see what people actually said. But that is not enough because of the second misstep, which is facts are not data. They may not be representative. So what do I mean by this? Even if something is 100% accurate, even we fully fact-checked it, it may still be misleading because it could be cherry-picked. It could be the exception that does not prove the rule. So, a very successful book was Start With Why by Simon Sinek, based on his TED Talk, which is the 3rd most viewed TED Talk of all time. And this says one of the big drivers of business success is having a purpose, having a why. And again, we all want this to be true. We all believe that having a passion, this is something which leads to success. We tell our kids you can do anything you put your mind to. If you know some of my earlier work and my first book, Grow the Pie, that was on the importance of purpose and passion. And so I wanted to lap this up. And so he backed this up with a lot of facts. Apple, started with why, absolutely has been successful. First company to be worth $1 trillion and then $3 trillion. Not just profit-making companies, non-profits. Wikipedia, clearly successful. That has surpassed the Encyclopedia Britannica as the world's fountain for knowledge. And also the Wright brothers, they were successful. They were the first to launch a test-powered flight, despite being much less rich than their competitor, Samuel Pierpont Langley. So these are all indisputable facts of organizations or people that started with why and succeeded. But this could be misleading. This could be meaningless because they could be cherry-picked. There could be hundreds of other cases of companies that started with why and they failed, but Simon Sinek will never tell you about them because they don't support his ideas. And it's not just his book, but other great guru business books, such as the likes of Jim Collins or Peters and Waterman, they only show you the cases that support their viewpoint. They never consider counterexamples. And again, let's think about the idea of one finger if you point, 3 fingers point back at you. Business schools, we all teach case studies, but how do we choose which case study to teach? The one which most illustrates our point in the biggest and most dynamic way. Again, it could be an exception. So what should we want to do? What we would like, ideally, is something like a clinical trial, where you have a lot of sick people, you give some of them the drug, see how many get better and how many get worse, and then you give some of them a placebo and see how many of them get better and how many get worse, and you compare the two. But importantly, your data set needs to consider people who took the drug and they still got worse. That is, companies that started with Y and they failed. Do we ever see them in a Simon Sinek or Jim Collins book? We don't. We also need people who took the placebo and still got better. Those are companies that did not start with Y, yet they still succeeded. Again, we will never see them in these guru books or in these case studies. They only look at the cases which support their viewpoint. So even if all of these are the gospel truth, they are 100% accurate, that is misleading because they're not showing you the full picture. So you might think, well, isn't the solution to get the full picture? If we have data which considers every company out there, then we should be home and dry? Well, the answer is sadly no, because of the third misstep up the ladder, which is data is not evidence, it may not be conclusive. So what does that mean? And what's the difference between data and evidence? Because we often see these terms being used interchangeably. So where do we see the word evidence most commonly? That is in a criminal trial. So evidence is evidence that supports one particular conclusion, it is conclusive. So if the evidence suggests that Tom or Dick or Harry could have killed Sarah, that is not evidence, it's not useful. The evidence needs to pinpoint one particular person. But the problem is data sometimes could have a huge range of different interpretations. It could be consistent with alternative suspects. So let's move again to our chosen field of investing. So there's lots of studies out there which show that more sustainable companies perform better. Again, I want this to be true as a strong sustainability advocate. And so we look at this correlation and we say, well, this is consistent with the idea that sustainability causes higher financial performance. But there's alternative suspects here, there's alternative culprits. Maybe there's common causes that cause both. Maybe a great CEO both improves the sustainability of her company and she also drives higher performance. There's no direct link between the two. Now you might think, well, we all know that correlation is not causation. I don't need a talk to tell me this. But we often forget about that when we like the story being paraded. We lap this up, our striatum is in overdrive, dopamine is going through our body, and we don't ask ourselves, hey, are there alternative explanations? We are like the police officer who has our preferred suspect, and we interpret all the evidence as consistent with him alone, even though there might be alternatives. So how do we, as busy people who have biases, just like I have my strong biases, how do we try to look at the difference between data and evidence? Well, it's to trigger that other part of our brain, the amygdala. And how do we do this? So here's a simple practical tip. If you see a study which you want to be true, imagine it showed the opposite result. So let's say a study found that sustainable companies lead to lower performance. How would we react to that? We get angry. It would trigger our amygdala. We would want to explain that away because we don't want this to be true. And we would appeal to alternative suspects. We might say, well, there's other stuff going on. Maybe it's management quality that drives both. Maybe a bad manager without a clear way to improve market share wastes money on sustainability. And that bad manager also is worsening performance. But now that we've alerted ourselves to the possibility of alternative suspects, ask ourselves, do those alternative suspects still hold, even though the result is in the direction we want it to be true? So why I think this idea of imagine the opposite is so powerful is it suggests that the solution to misinformation is not to get a PhD in statistics. Well, that's practically impossible. We don't all have statistical training. It's not to check every reference. We don't have the time to do this as senior investors. But it's just to apply common sense and discernment, which we already have within us. Whenever I see a study shared on LinkedIn that people don't want to be true, there's no shortage of comments as to why correlation is not causation, as to why the data might be cherry-picked. So we certainly have the ability to ask questions when we don't like the result, but we switch off that discernment when we see something that we want to be true and our striatum is activated. So the idea of imagine the opposite is just to activate the discernment that we have within us and to be just as discerning about something we do like as something we don't. Let me now go into the fourth and final step before concluding. Now, let's say we think we have nailed down causation in one particular field. Does this mean that we're home and dry? Does this mean we have proof? And the answer is no, because there's a difference between the two. Evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So what do I mean by this? Well, a proof is universal. When Archimedes proved that the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared, he proved this not only for all circles in ancient Greece in the 3rd century BC, but for all circles around the world, including in Oslo in 2025. But evidence is context-specific. So if the evidence suggested that Tom killed Sarah, and Tom is the husband, it doesn't mean that every time a person dies, it's always the spouse that did it. It's only true in that case. Yet we often will over-extrapolate and claim general rules. So Malcolm Gladwell said that there's a 10,000 hours rule, that to be successful in any field, you have to invest 10,000 hours into this. But the evidence that he gathered was only in violin playing. And then he said, well, this is true in every single field, such as chess and such as neurosurgery. And so this is one of the challenges with ESG. We might take a paper, such as my paper on employee satisfaction, and claim that Alex has proven that ESG always pays off. I've done nothing of the sort. I've just looked at one factor, employee satisfaction. It does not have implications for the entire forest. So let me end on one final, hopefully humorous note, which is, let's look at this study. Let me go back to health. And one other matter of life or death is what happens if your plane is about to crash. You need to jump out of the plane. Do you want to have a parachute? What a stupid question. Right, there's some dumb academic papers which study things which are clearly obvious. And so this is one of them. It was published in the British Medical Journal. It did a randomized controlled trial. It took people, made them jump out of planes, and it gave half of them who were lucky a parachute, and half of them who were unlucky, they had no parachute. And the question is, did the parachute prevent death? Sadly, no. Right, the same number of people died as who had a parachute as the ones without. So how can this be an ethical study, sending people to their death? Well, actually, nobody died because the plane was grounded. So people jumped out of a plane, but the plane was on the ground, and so clearly a parachute does not matter. But this was a satirical study. This is about the importance of range. So sometimes we will take a particular study and over-extrapolate to a different range, but here, the fact that a parachute does not matter for a 2-foot jump does not imply that it has no effect for a 10,000-foot jump. And so even if you were to believe my study on employee satisfaction, which shows that companies that treat their workers better do better, it doesn't mean that there is no limit to this, that we want to make employees as happy as possible by giving them $1 million per year. Everything will have diminishing returns and trade-offs. So even if something is true within a given range, it does not mean that it's true without limit. Okay, so here's just the ladder repeated again. And again, if this is something of interest, the conference has kindly made copies of my book available at the registration desk. So let me just invite Cyril to come back on for the questions and answers.
Thank you so much for a very interesting and illuminating talk. And you're going to have some questions from a second moderator, if you just have
Sure.
a seat at the very far end of the stage. But before we introduce him, just like to know, there is one person that has been fact-checked more than almost everyone. And he is now coming back as president of the United States. And the last time he was president, Washington Post found 16,000 plus mistaken, wrong, or simply lies. How would you explain that? Does fact-checking simply not convince us if we don't like it?
Yes, unfortunately, and this is because of the confirmation biases that we have, is that if we see something we don't like, we'll try to explain it away, we'll engage in motivated reasoning. And so this is why it's important to understand behavioural biases. The solution is not better facts, but to understand particular contexts and cultural meanings. So let's take the issue of climate change, which I'm sure is going to be interest to many people in this room. How can we get more, say, people on the Republican side to believe in the importance of climate change, not through providing more data and statistics, but to say that climate change is actually in accordance with Republican values. So if we say climate change means we need to regulate companies and have state intervention, people don't like that. But if you say, well, because of climate change, we need to rely on human ingenuity, companies having innovations such as launching solar reflectors into the atmosphere, finding ways to sequester carbon, that is absolutely in line with Republican values. So sometimes the cultural meanings that are associated with the facts are more important than the facts themselves.
Let me introduce now a man who shares your interest in sustainability. He's head of ESG at Skagen. His name is Sondre Myge. Please welcome Sondre.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. I felt like I was back at university doing revisions for research methods. I think it's a great way to start an investment conference as well, some repetition on the scientific method and Bayesian inference. But one of the questions that came to mind when you were presenting is whether or not there's a bias in how we use the scientific method to often produce positive findings rather than using the full force. Now, I know you have experience as an editor, and with risk of putting my feet to the fire on the ladder of misference, there was a study that found what they call positive selection bias in academic studies, that professors and academics were more likely to get published if they showed positive findings rather than neutral or negative. So is there an inherent bias in how we decide to apply the scientific method, both in academia and in general?
Unfortunately, there is. And again, it's one finger points out, 3 point back. And let me also try to look at some of the issues with my own profession is, well, journal editors are people too. And we have our own biases and we have our own incentives. And our incentives are to publish papers which get highly cited. This improves the impact factor of our journal. So when I was trying to publish my paper on employee satisfaction in 2011, nobody cared. So it got rejected by a couple of journals before finally being published because ESG was not of interest back then. Nowadays, every journal wants to publish on this particular topic. So what does this mean? So there was a really important paper by John Ioannidis in a Stanford medicine professor, why most published research findings are false. If something is with the grain of what we want to be true, it doesn't mean it's false, but it might mean that we want to be a bit more skeptical about it. And if something is against the grain, then we might want to pay particular attention to it. And also academic journals are trying to get better now at publishing non-result papers. So one thing which people have developed is the idea of a registered report where we say we're going to write a paper studying the link between A and B. And so the journal will pre-approve that and say we're going to publish this paper irrespective of what it finds. And so this means that you are not going to try to cook the data to find a significant result.
It's part of the driving force behind the post-truth world that you say we live in, a result of people and investors drowning in information and sort of pacifying our decision-making process.
Yeah, and again, so let's try to be on the side of people. So why I think people fall for misinformation is not we're bad people, it's not that we're intentionally biased or ideological, but we're humans. It's an irrational response to the idea that there's so much information out there. So when there's tons of information out there, what is the information that I'm going to be trying to look at? It's the one that I think to be true, and stuff that I think to be true will be the ones in accordance with my worldview. So if there's two studies out there, one of them says climate change is real, and one says climate change is a hoax, I've got limited time. I want to read one. I'm going to read the one which says climate change is real because I believe that to be true. And so it's going to be quite difficult for me to go against my viewpoint. So this is why we have to be quite intentional about it. And sometimes this can be uncomfortable. So in 2016, there was the Brexit referendum. I was a very strong Remainer. I thought anybody who believed in Brexit is xenophobic or uninformed. I made myself go to Brexit talks. And then I was shocked by the logic behind their argument. So even though I disagreed agreed with their conclusion, I could see the logical steps they'd made to reach their conclusion. And so this meant that when the Brexit vote went through, I was not one of the people saying, let's scrap the vote and have a revote. I respected the demographic will of the people, even though I personally voted for Remain.
And you're also a renowned and very outspoken scholar when it comes to sustainability and ESG, which has experienced, at least a few years now with backlash and criticism. And in my experience, I've heard the adage many times on ESG data and the lack of availability and the lack of quality, the notion that what gets measured gets managed. But you touched on it during your talk as well, that arguably if what you measure is not really measuring what it's supposed to, then the opposite is also true, that what gets mismeasured gets mismanaged. And what is your view on the state of ESG data and its, call it, uses and abuses in academia and in the industry?
I still fundamentally believe that ESG is a way to drive sustainable long-term investment returns, but looking at ESG data is not necessarily the way to do this because it takes something extremely complex and it tries to narrow this down to a couple of simple boxes to be ticked. And we've seen this in many other fields, right? If we were to reduce the quality of a company to just their quarterly earnings, well, that is something which is clearly partial. Let's again point the finger at myself. Look at my own field of education, the No Child Left Behind Act in the US. This said, well, let's try to measure school performance so that we can allocate capital. So it's very similar language to what we're using here in terms of allocating capital to companies. Let's try to measure performance according to standardized test scores. What we saw there was then teachers started teaching to the test, reduced a broad education to just some simple numbers. And I think this will be a potential problem with ESG. This is not to say that data is not useful. Clearly, as an academic, I believe in the power of data, but data should be the start of a conversation. So if you see, well, employee turnover has gone up, well, let's try to figure out why that is, rather than automatically not investing in that company. At Morgan Stanley, my first firm, we did have high employee turnover, and it wasn't that a bad thing, is our analyst training program was seen to be so good that private equity firms would come in and want to hire from us. That's a different story from, is there high employee turnover because people just voluntarily quitting because they're burned out? So data should be useful, but rather than seeing this as the end goal, that should be the start of a conversation.
And building on how we have conversations with companies, we talk quite regularly to management in the companies we invest in, and often on labor relations and human capital performance, which you've written a lot about. But what I find challenging sometimes is that I can bring these very interesting ex post observations to the management of a company and say there's ample evidence that treating your workers well is associated with better performance. But it's often challenging to take these ex post observations and make them ex ante when you want to start a new dialogue on a company, for example, improving on that trajectory. So how do we reconcile, and how do we convince companies to take on new information? Because that's often one of the key challenges, I would say, for people engaging companies on ESG matters.
Yeah. So I think whenever there's an issue, try to look at sort of what is the root cause of that issue, what is behind some of the challenges and the skepticism that they have. And it may well be that they believe that there's just a different paradigm there. So often people think there's a fixed pie and anything that we give to workers is at the expense of shareholders. And that could be true for certain things, such as wages, but there might be other things which could be pie growing, where we're improving conditions for workers and also improving outcomes for the company, such as, let's say greater delegation, greater psychological safety. They might not cost a huge amount in terms of financial investment, but there are things that make a big difference down the line. And number two, even for certain things which are zero sum in the short term, maybe they're not in the long term. So paying their workers more does reduce short-term profits, but in the long term, if it leads to more attraction, retention, motivation, then that helps. But sometimes it may well be that their own compensation is tied to something short-term. So even if you were to give them the evidence that it benefits them in the long term, they're not going to act according to that. Again, some of these issues are holistic issues, is we need to actually change the mindset and the horizon of the company.
Final question. So in the midst of the ESG backlash that we're in currently, you wrote a very meaningful paper to many in the industry, the paper on rational sustainability. And just for concluding remarks, what are the key tenets of rational sustainability for the audience to take home, and how can we apply that to your message here today?
Yeah, so when you think about this paper called Rational Sustainability, that seems to be a bit of a tautology, right? Sustainability must be a good thing. We want to have a cleaner planet, a cooler planet. So how can we have irrational sustainability? But that confuses two things. It confuses the goal with the approach. So even if the goal is absolutely desirable, which is sustainability, we can pursue it in an irrational way, just like diet and exercise and work. They are good, but we could irrationally diet and we could work too hard. So what rational sustainability is about is, yes, it's a good thing, but we still want to use data and evidence to guide us. So just like data might show that overwork is bad for you, actually some of the data suggests some dimensions of sustainability don't pay off, or sometimes sustainability is good up to a point there's diminishing returns. And rather than dismissing them as being by climate change deniers or racists or sexists or being politically motivated, sometimes this challenge is useful. So we want to understand, yes, there's benefits of sustainability, but just like anything else in economics where there's diminishing returns, sometimes there might be a limit. We want to use these challenges to inform us rather than them triggering our amygdala and saying, well, let's try to dismiss this.
Alex Edmans, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon.